share your final destination with anybody. I'm not even sure we knew it at the time. A lot of us suspected, because Diego Garcia had become a temporary training facility for the potential regional conflict that could come at any time. When I was in Guam, we were deploying crews to Diego occasionally. British-owned Coral Atoll, big Air Force presence, big U.S. Navy presence, and they had a great strategic center there and all the tools you needed. But anyway, so I went home, packed the bag. You've been through this exercise. The wives are a lot smarter than they give them credit for, or I should say the partners are. And I think within a matter of weeks when we left, they'd figured out where we actually went based on the ATO that they had to write on our letters. But we took off. We were fully loaded. We were fully armed and fueled. We left in, I think there were 15 airplanes deployed to our base, plus 6 others, I believe, came from a couple of other locations. They broke us all up into 3 ships formations, cells, we called them. I led one of the cells across. We really believed we were going to drop en route. And probably sometime after our second air refueling, around the 15 to 16 hour mark, we were told that we were going to retain weapons and proceed to Diego Garcia, where we would at least overnight. And so we landed, I think, 26 hours after takeoff.
Wow.
It's a British-owned territory. We weren't truly in conflict yet, so we actually had to clear customs. That caused a wrinkle among the groups, as, what do you mean you want my sidearm? You want my... It was kind of a crazy state for a few days, but within just a matter of probably 72 hours, it became clear we were going to be there for a bit of time. And as the troops as we were all there over time, the anxieties began to build. And it wasn't an anxiety of concern over what could happen. It was, let's do this thing. Let's get to business here. And our commanders began to get a little nervous about the temperament that was developing. And probably about the 40-day period, so September, October, somewhere in that time frame, we reached an agreement with the Saudi government that we couldn't land there until shooting started. They did not want to be 52 on their land proper, but they would allow us to practice low-level. Well, they didn't know it was low level, but they would allow us to practice missions over the Saudi peninsula. So around the October timeframe, we began to fly training sorties, just as we would probably end up fighting the first couple of nights of the war. So we were taking off out of Diego, catching some air refueling from the big tankers, cruise high level, bored out of our minds for 6 hours, start descending into that Saudi environment, catch another refueling before we got down to low level structures, fly a couple hours of low level practice, climb out, catch another refueling, and go home. And we did that until the actual conflict started, actually probably about 2 weeks before the actual shooting started. They kind of set us all down, gave us a period of just kind of calm. I think because they knew the shooting was actually going to start. We had a visit from General Horner at that time. I don't know if you recall, he was the Air War Commander during the conflict. He came to the island, visited with the entire squadron, scared the heck out of us because he basically reminded us that the Iraqi forces had acquired some pretty advanced weaponry, some of which we had no defense against in the B-52. And he assured us that probably 30% of the group wouldn't be going home. So that, there was an intimidation factor about that. I'm sure it created some anxieties, but let me tell you, it pumped us up.
But
it kind of pumped us up. We were ready to go.
Bring it on, right?
Yeah. So I don't want to rattle on here, but
no, you're doing great.
Yeah, eventually it came down to it was time for this to become a reality. And the strategy was, and I don't know how detailed I can or should get here, but the strategy was, because the Iraqi forces had acquired some very lethal equipment, both in the air and on the ground. The decision was made that what we needed to do is first take out the airfields that he had very rapidly built, he being Saddam Hussein, of course. And he had 5 principal airfields that were really beefed up with all the high-tech aircraft that he had purchased from wherever he could get it. They built these airfields so quickly that a lot of the structures on the field weren't completed. So they had weapons and stuff just sitting around on pallets. A lot of the buildings weren't complete, but they were all heavily defended with some of the most lethal AAA probably the world has seen since Hanoi or Haiphong.
Okay.
And I mean, beyond just the air to surface to air missiles, I'm talking the AAAs were just, I mean, they'd cut a plane in half, 6,000 rounds a minute, that kind of stuff.
Well, you're not exactly a small target, Doug.
No. The only advantage we had was we weren't supersonic, but when you're close, when you're traveling at 300 knots, it's almost like you're ahead of your sound. And our tactic was we attacked these 5 airfields in 3-ship formations at 250 feet or lower at night.
It's crazy.
And we split from our trail formation 2 hours from the target, so that based on timing and airspeed, we could cross the airfields. Our 3-ship packages could cross our specific target airfield at 180 degrees, 120 degrees out. So 45 seconds, one guy went across, another 45 seconds, another guy went across 120 degrees out of his predecessor's heading. And then third guy, 45 seconds later, would come across 120 degrees out of that guy's heading. So that was enough to fool them for the most part. Our fortune was that the radar guidance that they had capable with these systems, they either hadn't been adequately trained or failed to follow procedure or whatever, but they tried to shoot optically. So you remember the videos that you would see all the blue tracers in the sky, and our jobs across the target area was just to maintain a certain altitude for effective weapons release, and you could deviate a little bit. So you just kind of flew between the blue lines and hoped that they weren't really that good of an aim, and everybody came out pretty much safe and sound with very minimal damage. The weaponry that we carried across the sites was very, very effective. The first guy obviously wanted to minimize the potential for the people to get to the weapon systems, so their loading was for that specific purpose. Number 2 guy was always carrying some penetrating devices that could erupt taxiways and runways, and then the third guy across was bringing across another load of cluster type munitions that were actually like a landmine with these tripwires that would go out in multiple directions, and then they would either detonate based on proximity if people came out to clear or timing basis. It was very, very effective. After that night, there was, and to my knowledge, that's the only time that I think a group of B-52s have actually done combat at a low altitude. The threat was gone from the air after that night, and the rest of the war we fought from up high.
So you went in the very first night of the war?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So,
I think the only guys that beat us over target, and the launches globally were all timed, of course, as you know how these things work. I think some of the F-117s made it in ahead of us, and they were to take out the electronic defensive systems, the infrastructure.
Yep.
So it completely took that offline. And then I think we were pretty much next over the airfields.
I had forgotten that the wild weasels, right? Were still in existence then.
They were, and they were in a state of transition. They were leaving my beloved F4 to a new F-16 version of the Wild Weasel. And an interesting story, in one of our strike packages, my number 3 airship lost 10 feet of its tail of the B-52.
Really?
And we didn't even know. Yeah, we didn't even know this had happened. And course, when we struck targets, even at high level, we did the multi-axis strike, so it kept everything confused from a defensive standpoint. But there was always a rally point post-strike where you'd rejoin and then you fly home. So you had buddies with you to be safe all the way home. And the number 3 guy was having a difficult time making the rally point on time, and he eventually broke radio silence. I think the threats were not what they initially were, so there was really no threat of his breaking the radio silence at that point in time. But he basically called out and said, hey, I'm accelerating as much as I can, but I can't get up to speed. And so we basically slowed down and allowed him to catch us, and then we drifted back, and he couldn't catch us because his tail was gone and his drogue chute was out.
Oh, man.
And of course, most of it had been shredded, but there was enough drag from that thing out there. He just couldn't catch up with us. Once we saw that, he post-struck into Jeddah, where the airplane was eventually repaired and returned to its home base from Jeddah after the war.
Man, and how many missions did you wind up flying in Desert Storm now?
I think 17. That was the most intense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was, when you're flying an aircraft that has that wingspan of 200 feet, and you know that you've got to make a 30-degree heading change, you've got to climb so that you don't drag a wingtip in a sand dune. That's pretty intense. And I know.
Go ahead.
I was just going to add, I remember my radar navigator, Bombardier in the old days. I remember him screaming at me over the intercom to make minor heading corrections as we were inbound to the target, because I was so focused on not hitting ground, something. It was my flight suit was pretty well sweat soaked when we were done with that flight. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's funny because that was one of the questions I had for you was I didn't know the width. I knew it had an incredible wingspan, but I didn't know it was 200 feet.
Yeah.
You're flying at 250.
Yeah.
That's an incredibly small margin of error.
And,
man, that just goes to talk to and speaks to, I guess, the technical skill set and the ability of you and your teammates out there. I mean, you're doing something with an aircraft it was never designed to do.
Yeah. It is amazing how we concoct these crazy ideas, isn't it? I mean, and this thing is now, I don't know, what is it, in its 6th decade of life?
That's right.
I mean, getting ready to enter 7 decades of life. And, during Desert Storm, the B-1 was out there. They couldn't participate. We didn't have enough refueling assets to get them to the theater. A B-2 was just coming out of development. And an interesting story towards the end of that conflict, one of the last live missions was a round trip B-2 out of Missouri.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. 30, I think the crew, I talked to one of the crew members. I think he said it was 36 hours.
That's
just
incredible.
2 guys on the airplane. Yeah.
Yeah. Because they were used a lot, if I remember right, in Bosnia, flying out of Missouri.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, man, that's a long flight. Yeah. But I didn't realize they participated in Desert Storm. And I remember I get confused. So the B-1 was it wasn't the stealth, it was the B-2, or do I have it backwards? What was the stealth one?
You're correct. The B-2 is the stealth.
Okay, the B-2 is the stealth.
The B-1 was the 500,000-pound T-38. It looked just like an F-5 with wing sweep capability.
That's right.
And a great airplane, truly a great airplane. But just it had its share of problems because it ended up, the final design was by committee, and you know how that typically turns out.
I just remember that it was sleek as hell, and then you never heard about it again. I mean, it literally was like a huge prize, and the next step and the replacement for the B-52, if I remember right, and then nothing. It just kind of and then
exactly.
Then the B-2 came out. So
they actually a squadron came to Guam before Guam was closed to participate in a flying exercise with us, and we were flying a low-level local, it was called, just over the open ocean, using some islands that were uninhabited out there as practice bomb runs. And there was a segment, and it was during the daytime, there was a segment where they asked us to climb to 1,000 feet, and the B-1 went below us. and we were flying at our max airspeed at low level, and I remember the timing, he came across below us, and he just walked right away from it.